Right, so Keir Starmer has dropped the idea of recognising Palestine as a state in its own right, has he? All that talk about wanting to see a two-state solution. His commitment to that about as nailed on as his 10 leadership pledges were, it seems. But when Starmer is avowedly committed to the existence and survival and the prosperity of Israel, of a Jewish state, as a Zionist without qualification, his own words implies, does that not make his refusal to recognise a Palestinian state now as Islamophobic? At least by his own measure it would, surely. Since being anti-Israel is, according to Zionists, antisemitic as well. Actually, what he has said is even worse than that, because he said he wouldn't recognise an independent Palestinian state unilaterally. Therefore, he would only recognise such a state in effect if Israel do. He's placed a condition on it. Well, what business is it of yours to do that then? Right, so this story of Keir Starmer having binned the idea of recognising a Palestinian state, you can imagine he didn't need leaning on very heavily by a donor or a lobbyist to come to this idea of abandoning the Corbyn-era pledge of recognition of a Palestinian state, because for one, it was Corbyn's idea, and therefore it has to be pinned, because Starmer is still terrified of him. He's still living rent-free in his head, as bringing him up in a speech the other day proved. But equally, Israel has zero intention of ever allowing there to be a Palestinian state, and they've become increasingly more emboldened to outright say that. The UK ambassador for Israel, Zippy Ottaveli, now infamously saying as much in a TV interview the other week, that triggered a number of calls for her to be expelled from the country over it, but of course, she's still here. Now, this story, it does have to be said, despite having been picked up on social media and people running with it, has come from a notoriously untrustworthy news source in the Jewish Chronicle. But it's been out for some 24 hours now and nobody's refuted it, so maybe it's got some legs in this case. But then it is also the sort of story that will appeal to the JC, given it both bashes Corbyn and is pro-Israel. So what's Starmer apparently said then, Damo? Well, out goes Corbyn's pledge, which was to recognise a Palestinian state on day one of a Labour government, and instead in comes a two-state solution, inverted commas, at the right time in the peace process. Well, what peace process is that then? Because there isn't one, is there? No ceasefire can get past. Israel is committing genocide with impunity, and only South Africa have gone down the road of dragging them to court over that. A number of countries have now signed up in support of that, and kudos to them for that. Yemen have preferred to put muscle where their mouths are and blockaded Israeli shipping, of course, which has now led to the US and UK bombing Yemen. Because how dare they try and stop Israel's genocide of the other nation Starmer is apparently referring to in his idea of a two-state solution, where basically one nation has a say over whether the other becomes a state, and Israel are already saying no. I think that's where we're at. The entire Middle East is being destabilised, though, we do know this. And the one thing that makes sense to most people, the one thing that would diffuse it, the enforcement of a ceasefire, and Israel being told to get out of Gaza, is the one thing nobody will do. It's crazy. South Africa are now apparently going to take the US and the UK to the International Court of Justice for aiding and abetting in genocide, thanks to their bombing run in Yemen, and Starmer gave Sunak the nod to bomb Yemen, making him complicit too. So frankly, why should we care what Starmer has to say when, just like Rishi Sunak and Genocide Joe, they all belong behind bars now? Starmer really is a piece of work, isn't he? He's outdone Blair again, a blood-stained warmonger before he's got into power. Dead Houthis on his hands too. Israel will never recognise the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine existed before Israel did. I've got 2 family Bibles on a shelf that depict it. So it is a gross insult to say there cannot be a state of Palestine, or there isn't a state of Palestine, or that there is no state of Palestine, as Starmer's Middle East minister has said. A complete non-entity by the name of Wayne David. I had to look him up myself. He's the MP for Caerphilly. He's been an MP for over 20 years. And he went straight over my head when I saw his name. I had to Google him. So really making his mark in Parliament, clearly. But anyway, he's the Middle East minister, or shadow minister for Starmer, and he said, "We will recognise the state of Palestine at a point which will help the peace process once negotiations between Israel and Palestine and the others are taking place. It's not about the Labour government going, right, we recognise Palestine. Big deal. We want to see a state of Palestine being established, but there is not a state of Palestine now." Well, here's a newsflash for you, sunshine. Just because you and Keith won't recognise a state of Palestine, you might like to know that 72% of all UN member states do recognise a state of Palestine. So we here in the UK, or by we I say them, these non-entities in power, are in the minority. So get over yourselves. Palestine exists as a state. You might not like that. You might decide, well, I don't recognise you. Israel sure as hell don't either. But there it is. According to Wayne David, to just arbitrarily recognise Palestine as Corbyn wanted was t-shirt politics and would just antagonise people. Like who? Israel? Tough. Last year, David featured in an article on Welsh site Nation Cymru, which was entitled "Labour are not in the pockets of Israel, says Shadow Minister Wayne David." The article, from November last year, so only a couple of months ago, showed that 13 of the 31 members of Starmer's shadow cabinet have received funding from pro-Israel lobby sources. More than half are involved with Labour Friends of Israel, including Wayne David himself. So we've got t-shirt politics, a refusal to recognise Palestine without it being part of a peaceful resolution that nobody in the UK is calling for, and won't either until Genocide Joe decides to first, the US setting our foreign policy for us, in effect, but we knew that, and the opportunity to rub Corbyn's nose in things too because, well, this sorry bunch of Starmeroids just hate him, don't they? But here's the thing. A two-state solution can only ever work and only ever be viable if both states involved are involved on an equal footing. By making the statehood of one reliant on the viewpoint of the other, and especially when that other is genociding the former, there is no way a two-state solution that will last and work going forwards can come about. It's favouritism. It is backing on one state over the other, and when that state, the state of Israel's existence, is predicated upon Zionism, which is a political doctrine, but one that strives to claim it is religious as well, when you bring religion into this, when arguments get made that to deny the state of Israel's existence is to be racist itself, is to be anti-Semitic, how then, in which case, can it not be true that denying Palestine recognition would therefore be Islamophobic? I prefer to take religion out of this equation, personally, myself. I don't think it helps. In fact, I know it doesn't. I think it has helped Israel be excused of its actions for too many years. I think the religious aspect should be set aside. But in my view, if you invoke anti-Semitism when Israel gets criticised, if you don't therefore recognise Palestine too, you are, by your own measure, your own definition, as somebody calling for a two-state solution, Islamophobic. How can that not be the case? Does that not make Zionism as a political doctrine also a racist doctrine, when adherents to it talk of taking over Gaza and driving out the Palestinian people, of relocating them, as we have heard many pro-Israeli voices say? Starmer placing conditions on Palestinian statehood that he would never see put on Israel, and being a Zionist as he is, it's very difficult to see how he can avoid inviting accusations of being a racist in this there. A man who has gone to such lengths to say Labour is fixed and he's dealt with anti-Semitism, in his opinion anyway, but in fact he's just let other forms of racism like Islamophobia pervade. In fact, he seems to have had a hand in helping that by his words and deeds regarding Israel and Palestine. And policy moves like this are just rubber stamping that, are they not? When he's actually purged more Jewish people than any other Labour leader, it's a farce he claims to have dealt with anti-Semitism in any way, shape or form, in fact. Labour is just a narrow-minded, nasty party, more racist, not less, and still living in fear of the socialism it is supposed to stand for. A hierarchy of racism it's been called, of course. It's been exposed again and again, and if you watch this video here next, you'll find that even the Bernie Grant leadership programme encouraging more black leaders to come forward in the Labour Party isn't immune from it, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.